Hi, and welcome to the Roadmap to a Zero Trust Security Model, a cybersecurity thought leadership podcast from HMG Strategy and Okta. I'm Tom Hoffman at HMG Strategy, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. So Nick, earlier we had spoken about why companies should adopt a zero trust security model and the factors that play into this. Can you also offer recommendations for creating a zero trust model?
I'll share some insights that is sort of an aggregation of how our customers have approached this and some best practices that we've been hearing. And again, this is something that this approach varies for every organization, sometimes by industry, sometimes what stage of cloud adoption you're in. But I will share some trends and sort of phases by which a lot of our customers are thinking about embracing zero trust. And a lot of that comes with first doing almost an inventory of your data, your users, your devices, mapping your sensitive data. How is that data accessed? What are the different user groups you have? And starting to think about what kind of policies you want to implement around who should have access to what. And also thinking about policies around your workforce. Do you have a distributed workforce? Is that something you're looking to maintain? Is that something you're looking to ramp up as remote work becomes more and more top of mind for a lot of IT departments? What is your devices policy? Do you allow BYOD, personal devices, to be used to access corporate resources? Is that something that is within your security program, or do you want to enable that based on the type of workforce you have? And this can vary a lot based on regulatory requirements or the types of, again, mapping those types of users to their critical access. You might want to require more device management for those. So that's looking a lot about what the policies are at a business level that you want to deploy. And then we start to think about, we talked a bit about last time, zero trust is these days often thought of as how do we provide secure access in any situation. So really enabling the right people to have that right level of access to the right resource in the right context with least friction possible. And that last point is really critical, right? Because if you're not reducing friction and you're introducing security controls that are going to disrupt the business, as we know, users will often find their own way. They'll go around those policies if they're introducing too much friction. So really, zero trust needs to be a business enabler and friction reducer, not just a set of security controls. And so I'll share some insights into how some of our customers are thinking about trying to achieve those things together. Okay, so one of the first foundational steps that a lot of our customers take from a technology standpoint, after mapping their data, the users, their devices, after understanding their policies, is to look at identity platforms as that foundational control. As you're moving beyond the full trust model, where you had a castle and moat approach and were gated by the network-based perimeter, often in the form of a firewall, we now need to think about what is going to be that unified control point across users, across devices, across networks in a mobile and cloud world. And it is very clearly identity, right? That is the one constant across all those access points. And that can be identity of a user themselves, or that can be identity of a resource or service like an API. I'll come back to that a bit more in a second. So unifying identity and access management across your critical resources, whether they're applications, whether that's servers, maybe infrastructure as a service, you're spinning up a bunch of AWS instances, for example, or APIs even. APIs are increasingly the modern building blocks of applications. And as many organizations are going from maybe a monolith to microservices approach, how do you secure access to those APIs, make sure they're scoped appropriately? So these types of resources need to be thought of distinctly. And many organizations really start by thinking about the applications, the cloud apps, but you also need to often think about the on-premise applications. You want that one single control plane that you can use to set policy across critical resources, and maybe make some tweaks based on the criticality of that resource, whether that's an on-prem app or a cloud app. But at least having those all connected is really a foundational control point that we see a lot of our customers start with. And then it's mapping to the user groups. What level of authentication is needed based on that user and the sensitivity of the resource? How do we ensure that that user is who they say they are? before they access that resource. So if you're off the corporate network, we often see customers set policies around multi-factor authentication. It's one of the more foundational technologies to deploy alongside identity and access management as part of a foundational zero trust model. And we often see customers now start to map different factors per user group. So this kind of goes both ways on the security spectrum, right? You could have high risk users that are, say, more prone to phishing attacks that you'd want to maybe ship a YubiKey or a U2F token to ensure stronger authentication because we know they're more prone to being attacked. And you can get those signals through intuition about knowing that this is maybe a C-suite executive, or you can get those inputs and context through an integration with, say, an email protection vendor that understands who the very attacked people are in your organization. It's actually often things like people like the admins, right? So taking those inputs, embedding that, ingesting that into your identity platform and setting policies that say, hey, put those very attacked people into this user group that's maybe more high risk, and set stronger access policies based on that. So we see people integrating Okta with vendors like Proofpoint, for example, to accomplish that. And then on the other end of the security spectrum, you might have user groups that are maybe lower risk, but they simply don't have access or aren't able, for whatever reason, to bring things like smartphones into the workplace. So you might want to deploy factors like knowledge-based questions, like security questions for them, or SMS-based factors, which tend to be less secure, but can still provide a strong second factor of assurance for them. And so setting different factors per different user group is one of the key recommendations for starting to enable that secure access. And so we've talked a bit about user trust, authenticating that user is who they say they are, but device trust is also a core component of this as well. Is this device that they're on trusted? Is it a known device? Is it a device that is maybe managed for requirements for management to access certain resources? Or is this device secured? Do we know that it is free from malware? These are all elements of device context that are important for making access decisions. And we often see customers set access policies based on that device state. Is that device unmanaged? Well, maybe don't give them access to these critical resources. Or if the device is unmanaged, maybe you give them limited access to certain areas of the application based on integrations to that ISV. Or you might say, we will give them access, but require a stronger set of user authentication around that. So there's different policies based on that, but ultimately a model rooted in user trust and device trust is very consistent across the architectures for zero trust that we see from our customer base. And then you have to think about things like patching cycles and cadence, right, around your device. How often are you going to be patching those devices? And if it's managed, that becomes something you can start to enforce. And we touched a bit on context before, right? I've talked a lot about the context of that device. Is it managed, secured? Is it known? But there's other elements of context that we now start to see customers fold in when they're building their zero trust model. And this is all intelligence to help you better align that user experience to the risk. So you're not prompting for a second factor every time someone's trying to log in, but rather using more intelligence to better align that user experience to the true risk. And so we see that through things like looking at network context, right? We're not going to use network as a binary decision to say, hey, you're automatically trusted if you're on the network, but it is an indication of risk. If you're logging outside the network, maybe you need to do a step-up authentication or a location that we've never seen you log in from before. These are all types of context that you can set policies around to build up a risk profile of that authentication attempt. And then we start to see companies look beyond that and say, hey, we've got all these different policies that are discrete elements of context by which we're setting policies. How do we get an overall risk score, a risk profile of that one authentication attempt? And we start to see customers trying to leverage things like machine intelligence to recognize the typical patterns of a user and then set policies based on, say, hey, if this machine says that it's a high risk authentication attempt, then either deny access or prompt for a second factor. So that's all ways where we can better align that user experience to the risk. And then the holy grail for a lot of the customers we talk to is deploying these policies and then mapping that alongside a passwordless authentication policy. So in areas where you have maybe a relatively low risk authentication attempt, can we remove the password from the experience entirely? Maybe replace it with simply a lightweight push notification to a mobile device that has our authenticator app, or use like a biometric on the device, like Touch ID or a Face ID. There's a lot of really interesting things happening in the passwordless world around things like web authentication and FIDO 2.0 protocols that are making it a much more standardized approach to integrate these authentication policies within any application across the web. So very exciting stuff, and we're seeing a lot more customers move towards that. And then really, identity is not your silver bullet for zero trust. Any organization that talks about a piece of technology as being a silver bullet is that's very dubious, right? You want to, it's part of a stack of technologies that integrate, integrating identity and access as the foundational layer, but integrating it across other zero trust technologies like unified endpoint management solutions, or endpoint detection and response to get that device context. Is that device compromised? Is that device managed? Or those email protection vendors, or ones that can give you better network signals, right? So this is basically using identity as your control point, but then getting context either natively from that identity solution or through integrations with other endpoint or other zero trust type vendors is really critical and sort of a foundation of a lot of architectures we're seeing. And then the last thing I'll talk about is it's really not just about technology, right? It's about training your people and deploying processes that are consistent and rooted in the business and security goals that you have. And one thing we see a lot of customers doing now is there's sort of a rapid acceleration of security policies based on the need to go to remote workforce. You need to be documenting those changes you're making in the short term, because they may become permanent or elements of them may get dialed back, but some of the foundational policies you're setting up may be carried forward. So that's a lot. I know I covered. That's a lot of some best practices that we're seeing really across industries on how customers are looking at creating a zero trust model. But again, it's going to vary a lot based on your security needs, your business goals, and how you want to enable that workforce.
Thanks, Nick. That was great. Appreciate the insights. So in our third podcast, we'll be exploring recommendations for keeping zero trust models fresh and vibrant going forward, and how to do so.